Now, for me, as a politician, there are times in politics where you just become so passionate about something. And this is one of them for me, and I dare say I'm talking at a time where everybody's passionate, whichever side of the divide you're on, for the 18th of September. But be in no doubt about the importance of this campaign. I got involved partly because I was on the Education Committee at Holyrood, but I also got involved for many of the similar reasons to those that Stuart spoke about earlier, because fundamentally I have two principal objections to this. And the first is, has been spoken about by some of the contributors to the film that you've just seen, is this fundamental issue about trust. For me, and I'm a former school teacher of 16 years, in fact I'm still a registered teacher because I take part in a lot of outdoor activity and still coach a lot of children in outdoor, both in terms of outdoor adventures and in terms of school sport. And it grates on me that there should be a situation whereby somebody else who is appointed by the state is responsible for your child. Because for me, the vast majority of parents across Scotland are doing a thoroughly good job, and they do not need to be told by the government how they should look after their family. That's just completely unacceptable. And I think if you are a parent who is told that you will have a named person, and as the gentleman said in the film, it's not by consent, you are told that this is what is happening. The relationship which you then have with a health visitor, if it's between the age of 0 and 5, or the head teacher if it's beyond that age, that changes that crucial relationship that you ought to have. Now, I know what it was like as a teacher, and it was a very important relationship that any teacher could have, not just with the pupils, but with their parents too, and with their family. And if that is in any way broken or tampered with, then I think society is heading down completely the wrong road. But the second reason that I have for being so anti this policy is that I actually think it's going to do huge detrimental effects to the very children that we're trying to help. Now, this policy, and I'll come to the Children and Young People's Bill in a minute, but this policy was born out of trying to help our most vulnerable children. And there is absolutely nothing wrong in that, because let's be honest, if you look at the very stark statistics, you see just how many children are in difficulty because their parents are unable to look after them properly. And so we have to have at the background this thought about these children, because they do need help. You couldn't leave them in some circumstances with their parents, or in those where you can leave them with the parent, they need help. The budgets that are required to look after these children are huge. They are absolutely huge. And therefore, to insist that every single child between the age of 0 and 18 has to have a named person, well, you can imagine what the money involved in that, and the resources that are involved in that, to take away from the very children that we're trying to help. So there's a practical aspect to this as well as the moral issue for me. And I find it very difficult indeed to accept that this is a policy on a universal basis, particularly when you are talking about youngsters between the age of 16 and 18, because if you look at most aspects of Scots law, adults are defined at the age of 16 and beyond in any case. So this is not only going against the principles of the European Court in the way that the legal battle is being fought just now, but it's actually undermining an awful lot of the other legislation that we have in Scotland in any case, because if you are an adult at age 16 and you're regarded as somebody who has the responsibility to get married or to fight for your country or whatever else it might be, are you really trying to tell these 16 to 18-year-olds that they're not responsible to look after their own lives? And you know, I would just ask you to think about the circumstance where you've got a young married couple, age 17, 18, and they've got a youngster. Do they really have to have 3 named persons in the family? Because that's what this legislation means, and be in no doubt about the complications that that could raise. I don't think the government has given any thought to some of the practical difficulties of this, as well as the ones where I think there are severe moral issues. Now, I want to say something about the Children and Young People's Bill, because it is a huge bill. It's one of the biggest ones to have gone through Holyrood in the time, in fact all of Holyrood's time since 1999. It's a massive bill, and there are parts of the Children and Young People's Bill which are perfectly acceptable in terms of looking at the legislation that goes around rural schools. There are very good pieces of legislation within the bill about, or is it now, I shouldn't say a bill, it's an act now, in terms of kinship carers and the way that we look after many of our more vulnerable children. So there are good things in this act too. But at the real cutting edge, we have this named person policy. And it came about because of the Scottish Government's desire to ensure that there was a level playing field for looking after all our children. They didn't want youngsters falling through the net, neither do I, and neither does any politician, neither does anybody sitting here. But it was put across as something that had to have a level playing field and a complete blanket policy. And I think in that context, the evidence that we took at the committee, there was 129 submissions to the Children and Young People's Bill, and the vast majority of these came from our longest and in many cases our best serving children's charities. And naturally, that evidence supported most of our vulnerable children, and I don't take anything away from the evidence that we were presented with. But very little evidence came from groups that are supporting parents who we would not normally see as vulnerable children. Of course, that's the vast majority. So I think when we were taking the evidence, the committee, in my opinion, listened very carefully to that. But I think at the end of the day, I think it was completely skewed, and I don't think there was nearly enough questioning. I tried my bit, but there were other colleagues who I think tended to accept that this was a committee whereby we had to have this level playing field. We had to have this because of the situation of the increasing number of vulnerable children. And I think that context was mistaken. And that's why my party decided not to support the bill in the final stages. I have to say the other political parties did decide to support it because they felt that there were compelling reasons to go ahead with it. But I think what happened afterwards, thanks to groups like yourselves and thanks to groups who represent parent-teacher council in schools, etc., I think the awareness that has arisen out of this is very substantial. And I know for a fact that the Scottish Government started to get very worried when they saw the media reaction and obviously some of the reaction that you had on your video. And I think that reaction is increasing. And I think it's a negative reaction because I don't think parents want this. There may be some who want it, but I don't think many parents want it. But we're still, and this worries me even more, I don't think they actually know it's happening. And that's something that bothers me particularly because I think the state has become all-powerful in this respect. And for me, that's just completely unacceptable. Now, it was put up to us at the Education Committee in Holyrood that the council, the local authority that had the greatest experience of getting it right for every child was the Highland Council. And just to explain that the structure of Highland Council, because of many geographical reasons, is slightly different from a lot of local authorities across Scotland. So they tend to have more of a joint approach from their health departments and the social services departments and education. It has, for quite a long period of time, had a much more joined up approach than has been the case in other local authorities. And some aspects of that in Highland Council have been very well led. Let's not say that Highland Council is all that's bad, because it's not. It's been very well led on that. But the evidence about GIRFEC in Highland Council, and particularly about the named person policy, to my mind, wasn't there. I do not see, even now, I do not see the compelling evidence that suggests that in Highland Council this has actually worked. I don't see that evidence. There may be one or two families that could pick out evidence, but there's an awful lot of other families who can pick opposite evidence to say that it hasn't worked. And I felt slightly uneasy about that the Scottish Government was continually referring to this one council without being able to come out with lots of other councils, because, you know, one council out of 32 local authorities, quite frankly, doesn't really say terribly much about the support for it. But of course, all councils have now been told that they have to go ahead with this. And we have 5 councils that are now operating the policy. We've got a few in the pipeline just as we speak. And it comes into operation by 2016. But there's also a huge cost factor in this. And it's a cost factor that has to be borne by the local authorities, because they're the ones that have to come up with the money to do this. And again, the planning ahead, the Finance Committee at Holyrood was asked to look at the financial memorandum that always goes with a bill at Holyrood, and that financial planning was simply non-existent in the Finance Committee. And I have to say, all credit to the SNP and the Labour and the Liberal colleagues on that committee. They gave the Scottish Government ministers a very tough time, because the financial memorandum suggested that this policy has not been properly costed. There are huge issues about what happens in holiday time. Obviously, if it's a head teacher who's being asked to be the named person, do you really expect that head teacher to be around for 365 days in a year? You know, there are practical issues about this that nobody has actually resolved. And can I just say, as somebody who knows all about head teacher, I was not a head teacher myself, but I know all about it. To ask somebody who's a head teacher to be the named person for every child in their school, on top of the job that they're already doing, perfectly well, I may say, and they have a guidance teacher structure in place, they have form teachers, they have house staff, why do they need that? I simply don't accept that that is required. I think the school structures that we have are perfectly capable of sorting out the problem, providing the human input to that process is properly done. And I'll finish on a point that I always make when I speak about this issue. I think it's very difficult nowadays, increasingly difficult, to be a poor teacher. The standard of teacher training in the last 4 or 5 years has become so much better than when I went through it, far better, and I think it is much more difficult to be a poor teacher. I think the GTC in Scotland has gone to great lengths to ensure that it's not just about classroom training, it's about all the other issues, particularly those issues about how to deal with the most vulnerable children. And that's not just for teaching staff, that training is going on for support staff too, and that's a huge change in the whole psychology of schools, and that's important. And I also think it's true about health visitors, because health workers are increasingly trained. If you speak to the Royal College of Nursing and many of the groups who are involved in the health visitor thing, they've done a huge amount to improve their training too. And so I think we're putting a situation for families is one where we are basically interfering with the right to private life and to the decisions that they think are best for their children. If they need help, and many of them do, they have all the resources to hand. And if you look around all the problems that have happened with vulnerable children, and I say there are many, it's not usually the structure, it's not usually the system that is wrong, it's usually human error, it's a human failing. And that's about leadership, ladies and gentlemen. And I do not believe that a named person policy is going to do anything to improve leadership. I think the burden it's going to put on too many people is that it will make them have far too much to do at a time where they're already overburdened with a lot of work. So I leave you with the one thought, to ask what the added value could possibly be of having this named person. Because I also think that's a good approach to think about. Is there something extra that we could benefit from in this? And I think the vast majority of parents across Scotland will say no, but worse still, I think they will actually see that it takes away from their private life. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.